September 14th, 1954. Southern Ural region, Soviet Union. 9:33 in the morning. A Soviet bomber flying at 8,000 meters releases a single device. The device has a name. Its name is Tatyana. 45 seconds later, Tatyana detonates at 350 meters above the Earth. The explosion is 40 kilotons, the equivalent of 2 to 3 Hiroshima bombs. A mushroom cloud rises into the sky. The trees within 5 kilometers are gone. The villages within that radius are gone. The animals are gone. The ground itself has been rearranged. 3 hours later, 45,000 Soviet soldiers are ordered to march toward the epicenter. They receive no explanation. They receive no information about radiation. They receive gas masks, capes, gloves, standard equipment, the kind of gear soldiers put on before crossing a river contaminated with chemical agents, not the kind that offers any protection against what has just happened 3 kilometers ahead of them. They march forward, into the cloud, into the heat, into the silence where a forest used to be. This is the story of what the Soviet system was willing to do to its own people, not in the name of war, not in the name of production or ideology or emergency, but in the name of a question. The question was simple, and it was horrifying. Can a soldier, after witnessing a nuclear explosion, still be made to fight? Before you can understand what happened at Totskoye, you need to understand what the Soviet military believed about nuclear weapons in 1954. The belief was this: nuclear weapons were artillery, large, spectacular, devastating artillery, but artillery nonetheless. You dropped them on the enemy's defensive positions. You waited for the blast to finish. Then your infantry advanced. This was not a fringe idea. It was official doctrine. The Americans believed the same thing. Both superpowers, having constructed weapons that could end civilization, had written manuals for using them the way you would use a very large tank shell. The problem with this doctrine, the problem that no military had yet solved, was the human problem. A shell explodes, and your soldiers advance through smoke and debris. They've been trained for this. Their nervous systems have been conditioned by exercises, by repetition, by years of preparation to function in conditions of extreme violence. But a nuclear weapon doesn't just explode. It creates an experience so far outside any human frame of reference that no one knew whether trained soldiers would continue to function as soldiers or whether the spectacle would simply break them, dissolve the discipline and training in a wave of animal terror that no ideology, no loyalty, no oath could survive. The Soviets needed to know, and they decided to find out. The location was chosen with care. Previous Soviet nuclear tests had been conducted in the flat, featureless plains of Kazakhstan. But Kazakhstan looked nothing like Western Europe. And Western Europe, specifically the wooded, hilly terrain of West Germany, was where Marshal Zhukov believed the Third World War would actually begin. So they chose Totskoye, a training ground in the Orenburg region of the southern Urals, halfway between the cities of Samara and Orenburg. The landscape, mixed forest, oak groves, rolling terrain, the landscape's resemblance, a battlefield in Germany. During the Second World War, this same remote location had served as a prison camp for Polish prisoners. The preparation began months in advance. 45,000 troops arrived through the summer of 1954, carried in by rail, unloaded at the small station at Totskoye. None of them, not even the unit commanders, were told why they were being deployed here. The most persistent rumor among the men was that the Korean War had restarted. Some thought they were being sent to fight in China. Women and children met the trains at every station along the route. They handed the soldiers food, sour cream, eggs. They wept. "Darlings," they said, "I suppose you are going to fight." The soldiers dug. For months they dug. Hundreds of kilometers of trenches, anti-tank ditches, reinforced dugouts. The clay was hard, mixed with gravel. Every gram of it came up with difficulty. The most forward positions, just over 1 kilometer from the designated ground zero, received specially constructed underground shelters, prefabricated pipe-shaped bunkers, designed to survive a direct nuclear event at close range. What the soldiers were not told, they were building their own test environment. They were constructing the laboratory in which they would become the subjects. The men selected for this exercise were not chosen randomly. They were carefully screened. They were sworn to secrecy. They were paid 3 months' salary in advance. 3 months' salary for 1 day. That detail was communicated without any elaboration, and no elaboration was needed. Everyone who signed understood what it implied. The exercise was given a code name, Snezhok, Snowball, or in some translations, light snow. This is worth pausing on. The Soviet military named the operation in which 45,000 men would march through a nuclear blast zone, light snow. It is the kind of detail that tells you more about a system's relationship to its own violence than any document could. At 9:33 in the morning, the Tu-4 bomber releases Tatyana. The bomb misses its target by approximately 280 meters. This places the explosion measurably closer to the forward-positioned troop units than the plan specified. No one adjusts the exercise. The mushroom cloud rises 15 kilometers into the sky. The winds on that morning are strong, up to 20 meters per second. The radioactive cloud begins its journey. It will travel not just over the training ground, but across the Soviet interior, reaching as far as Novosibirsk, thousands of kilometers away. The contamination does not stop at the boundary of the exercise zone. It was never going to. 5 minutes after detonation, Soviet artillery begins firing into the blast zone. The rationale: soften any remaining enemy positions. The reality: soldiers on the other side of those artillery rounds are breathing the air from the crater. Then comes the order to advance. The first thing the soldiers see when they emerge from the trenches is the mushroom cloud. One veteran, Ivan Skvortsov, described it decades later. The moment we got out of the trenches, we saw a gigantic mushroom cloud rising in the distance. This is the moment the entire exercise was designed around. Not the explosion, not the radiation, not the military maneuver. The moment when a human being, standing upright in a field, looks at what a nuclear weapon does and is then ordered to walk toward it. The Soviet commanders watching from a reinforced bunker at a safe distance. Among them, Marshal Zhukov himself, and present observers including Nikita Khrushchev and Marshals Konev, Rokossovsky, and Vasilevsky, were not primarily measuring blast damage to equipment or structural integrity of fortifications. They were watching to see if the men would obey. The men obeyed. This is the detail that history has largely failed to examine. 45,000 soldiers, after watching a nuclear detonation from positions as close as 5 kilometers, were ordered to advance through the contaminated zone. Most of them complied. The exercise, from a purely military doctrinal standpoint, was declared a success. The data the Soviet military extracted from Totskoye was used to validate the proposition that tactical nuclear warfare was feasible, that soldiers could function in a post-detonation environment, that the psychological rupture produced by a nuclear explosion was survivable, that the machine of a modern army could absorb the experience of atomic fire and continue to operate. What the data did not measure, what the Soviet military had neither the intention nor the apparatus to measure, was what happened to those men afterward. Some soldiers began experiencing nausea and headaches on the march back to base that same afternoon. The official explanation: fatigue, physical exhaustion from the exercise. No formal diagnosis of radiation sickness was recorded. No medical investigation was initiated. The soldiers were not examined by specialists in radiation exposure because no such specialists were present, and because acknowledging radiation exposure would have required acknowledging what the exercise actually was. The secrecy oath each man had signed before the exercise was now its own instrument of harm. Soldiers who developed symptoms in the months and years that followed, cancers, chronic illness, inexplicable deterioration, went to Soviet doctors carrying medical files that contained falsified service records. The files did not say, "This man marched through a nuclear blast zone on September 14th, 1954. The files said nothing about Totskoye at all. The doctors turned them away. There was nothing in the record to explain what they were seeing. And even if there had been, the record was a lie. In the region surrounding the exercise ground, hospital archives from 1954 to 1980 were destroyed. 26 years of medical records, cancer rates, birth patterns, chronic disease in the civilian population, living downwind of a 40-kiloton detonation. Gone. Not lost, destroyed. The destruction of those archives is not the concealment of the story. The destruction of those archives is the story. For 36 years, the men of Totskoye carried this in silence. The secrecy oath prohibited them from speaking about the exercise for 25 years. And even after the formal prohibition expired, the institutional reality remained unchanged. There was no mechanism for acknowledgement, no procedure for claim, no category in the Soviet bureaucracy for victim of state nuclear experiment. They were not prisoners. They had not been arrested or condemned. They had been soldiers obeying orders in an exercise given the name of winter weather. In 1990, 36 years after the event, a committee was finally established to provide medical treatment to surviving participants. By that point, the men who had been in their 20s on September 14, 1954, were in their 60s. The years between had passed without care, without recognition, without a single official sentence acknowledging what had been done to them. The Soviet Union did not apologize. The Soviet Union collapsed the following year. Here is the philosophical core of what happened at Totskoye and why it matters beyond the specific horror of its facts. The question the Soviet military was trying to answer, can soldiers function in a nuclear environment, was never really a military question. It was a question about whether the human being could be made to override the most fundamental biological imperative that exists, the impulse to survive. The state needed to know whether the machinery of obedience, training, hierarchy, ideology, oath, the long conditioning of a soldier's identity, could defeat the instinct that screams at every living thing to move away from annihilation. At Totskoye, it could, but this is not a story of soldiers who failed. It is a story of a system that succeeded in something it should never have attempted. The men who marched forward were not weak. They were the product of a machine that had been built over decades to produce exactly this kind of compliance. Men who had survived the Second World War, the purges, the famine, the terror, men for whom obedience was not an abstract virtue, but a survival strategy internalized across a lifetime. The Soviet state did not test whether soldiers could withstand nuclear fire. It tested whether it could make them walk into it. And when the answer came back yes, it recorded the result, classified the data, falsified the medical records, silenced the witnesses, destroyed the archives, and waited for the men to die. The exercise at Totskoye remained classified until the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In 1990, fragments of information began to surface. Veterans, old men by then, began speaking for the first time. The accounts they gave were measured, factual, stripped of drama. The drama was in the facts themselves. What emerged from those testimonies was not the image of soldiers broken by what they had witnessed. It was something more unsettling. Soldiers who had done exactly what soldiers are trained to do, who had continued to function, who had performed the exercise with discipline and competence, and who had then spent the rest of their lives unable to explain to their own doctors why their bodies were failing. The Soviet system did not destroy these men with the bomb. It destroyed them with the silence. In 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin told the State Duma that the United States was the only country in history to have used nuclear weapons. The men of Totskoye, the ones who were still alive, heard this. The bomb that fell on them was called Tatyana. It had a name. They remembered its name. History is not an archive that can be destroyed. It is a record written in the bodies of the people who lived it. The Soviet state understood this better than almost any institution in the modern era. It is why the archives were burned. It is why the medical files were falsified. It is why the oath of silence lasted 25 years. What the system could not account for was this. The bodies themselves were the document. Every cancer, every illness, every death that came too early in the town's downwind of Totskoye was a sentence in a record that no bureaucracy could expunge. The regime tested whether soldiers could survive nuclear fire. The survivors became the testimony, and the testimony has outlasted the regime that created it, the state that concealed it, and the men who watched it all from the safety of a reinforced bunker and called it Snowball. What do you do with a history your own government tried to erase? Leave your response in the comments, because the story of what happens when a state decides its own people are expendable data is not a question that has an expiration date.